Hello everybody and welcome to part 36 of Kerbal Space Program. The journey continues, the final episode of our mission to explore all of the major bodies in the inner Kerbal system, which is basically all of the bodies in the inner Kerbal system, with the exception of Gilly. We'll be leaving that for any potential future series, as we will Jewel and its moons, and of course Elu, but for the moment our focus is very much on the present. We're here in deep space with our interplanetary craft, the Ptolemy, having recently completed its survey of Dres, and is now on its way back to Kerbin. And all we need to do now to finish off the aforementioned mission is to bring this ship, its crew, and of course its cargo of science, back home. The one problem with all of this is that we've got a while to wait. This ship is over a year and 100 days away from Kerbin, so we've got a bit of time accelerating to do, but fortunately, there's plenty of stuff to be getting on with in the meantime. Now, inevitably with this series, if we've got a lot of time to kill, some of that is going to involve the science lab aboard our space station, the Socrates, in orbit above our home planet. As I mentioned in the previous episode, we need to check on this thing roughly once every 100 days, and so we have to check this thing 5 times before the Ptolemy gets back, transmit all the science back to Kerbin, top up the science lab with any more experiments that it needs. You know the stuff by now. From a science perspective, it's a bit weird doing a series like this, drawing everything to a close, to a definite endpoint, not launching anything new, anything for which we'd need fresh tech, just letting the science sit there and accumulate. By the time the Ptolemy, its crew, and of course its science gets back to the KSC, we will have well over 40,000 points worth of science to spend. It feels a bit wasteful not doing anything with it, but the flip side of that coin is that we should be able to create some really nice new ships should we actually go for that third series. I don't know, we'll have to see. Anyway, with the science dealt with, I'm not going to show you all 5 of these, just this one. We've got a couple more things to take care of, just to sort of tidy up some loose ends before the series comes to a close. Now, over the course of this series and its predecessor, we've launched a number of probes, sent them off to perform some experiments somewhere, and then brought them back to Kerbin, where I've parked them in orbit just in case we do something with them in the future. I think it's kind of like my hoarding instinct leaking into KSP here. We've currently got 3 such satellites orbiting Kerbin, but I think we can say that we're not going to use all of them again. In fact, I think we can say with reasonable certainty that there's 2 in particular that we're not going to use, and we should probably give them a spectacular retirement. We start then with this, the probe we sent sort of as a nuclear testbed on a quick mission to gather some orbital science around the moon. Now, we're definitely not going to be using this again, so it's time for us to deorbit it and let it fall not so gracefully back down towards Kerbin. We're going back quite a while for this probe. I think it was about halfway through the journey begins, as I said, just to test out the nuclear options that were available to us. But it performed its task well, but I think we could probably have seen earlier than now that it's not going to be of any further use to us. The candle nuclear engine we're using on this isn't particularly powerful, but it's a very light probe, and it doesn't take us long to bring our periapsis down to something terminal. We're going to be coming down just into the night side of Kerbin, so as we feel the fires of re-entry, we quite fittingly see the sunset, both literally and figuratively, on our little probe. Those fierce fires of re-entry don't actually do a lot, though. I was hoping to see more. They just ripped the solar panels off. I flipped the probe around trying to get some more temperature-sensitive parts to bear the brunt of the re-entry. Try and see a bit more destruction, but sadly no. The rest of the probe does survive into the lower atmosphere. If re-entry doesn't get you, though, then crashing into the ground at nearly 1/4 kilometre per second surely will. And with that, we have bid a very fond farewell to that little probe. But as I mentioned earlier, this isn't the only victim of our decluttering efforts today. Next up on the chopping block, we have a slightly more recent addition to our collection, our Ion probe, which earlier this series was tearing it up around NOHO, collecting plenty of gravity data for us, but it is a solar-powered probe, which means it's only useful in the inner Kerbal system, and we've done all the unmanned exploration we want to do there, so sadly it is of no further use, and it will be going the same way as our earlier nuclear test probe. However, whilst deorbiting that nuclear probe was child's play, this is a little bit trickier. Well, not trickier, just a bit more long-winded. I can't remember, but I think rather foolishly when I came up to collect the science from this probe, I gave it a good refueling, which means its thrust-to-weight ratio is now utterly abysmal. I'm trying to bring this down on the day side of Kerbin, but as I mentioned, this probe is solar powered, so we can only use those engines in the daylight, which complicates things. I just have to start thrusting as soon as the sun hits and just try and bring that periapsis lower and lower and lower over several passes. On our penultimate orbit, we get the periapsis down to about 65 kilometres, pass through the upper atmosphere, swing back around the other side of the planet, and make what is very much this probe's final burn. Our approach of burning as early as possible over multiple passes has meant that we will be coming down on the day side of Kerbin. I feel a bit sadder about losing this probe than I did the previous one. This one took a lot more effort to build, the mission certainly took a lot more effort, but as I said, we've no further use for it, so we may as well get some fireworks out of it whilst we can. Well, I say fireworks, but it turns out this probe is also irritatingly hardy and also survives into the lower atmosphere with only the loss of its solar panels. I did turn off stability assist, let it flip around of its own accord, but nothing seemed to cause the extra destruction we were after. The ground comes to the rescue once again, though, as slamming into that at 160 metres per second on the dot does the trick. And with all the housekeeping out of the way, it's time for us to return to the Ptolemy and see how that's getting on. So, 4 lots of station science and 2 destroyed probes later, and our interplanetary craft is now about 60 days away from Kerbin, which those of you who watch the series regularly will know is roughly the time I like to check in with the craft, see if it's on a good approach to its destination planet, and perform a correction manoeuvre if it's not. And, well, it never is, so here goes. So we switch to the map view, we see what's going on, and at the moment it looks like we're coming in for a polar orbit, which, is going to have to be fixed. So we set up a manoeuvre node, we start trying to get that periapsis marker into a more reasonable place. This is a bit fiddly, it's kind of difficult to tell from this angle exactly where it is, but eventually I get it where I think is roughly in the right place. We refocus the map view on Kerbin and we play about with that periapsis node until it's roughly where we want to end up, about 2,000 kilometres above the surface of Kerbin. With that manoeuvre planned, we get the Ptolemy pointing in the right direction and ready to perform that burn. Now, as I mentioned last episode, I have gone ahead and uninstalled better burn times, thinking that would fix the issue with the burn time indicator. Turns out that wasn't the problem. No, KSP's just struggling to understand the interstellar mod nuclear engines, so that hasn't fixed it. And it also causes a little bit of a problem later on, but we'll get to that in a bit. For now, though, everything is looking rosy and our crew is nicely set up to get themselves in a decent orbit around Kerbin, which, as I said, will be in about 60 days' time. Having briefly refocused our attention elsewhere to deal with the 5th and final bunch of station science for this episode, we return to the Ptolemy, now about 35 days away from its encounter, and follow it in until it reaches Kerbin's sphere of influence. So close now, we just got to be careful to carry this one over the line. The next stage of this is, of course, to make sure we don't just go shooting straight past home, so it's time to set up our orbital insertion burn. Now, this one's fairly elementary, just a straightforward burn of a little under 1,600 metres per second, and that should set us up nicely. We get the Ptolemy pointing in the right direction, we time accelerate a little bit, and we get ready to light up those engines. With the aforementioned burn time indicator problems, I kind of have to guess the start of this burn. In the end, it turns out to be slightly early, but not too bad all things considered. For those of you who are new to KSP or new to this side of KSP and are wondering why I went for 2,000 kilometres, I'm kind of trying to balance a couple of things here. The most fuel-efficient approach overall is to just get your periapsis as low as you need to go and do your orbital insertion in one burn, and that's it out of the way. But I also need to do a plane correction manoeuvre, and those are more efficient the higher your altitude. So as I said, trying to balance those two things. I also need to leave a little bit of manoeuvring room between ourselves and the space station, which is our ultimate destination. With that burn complete, it's time for us to perform the plane change, get ourselves lined up with the Socrates. Now, we're in quite an inclined orbit at the moment, and this one's going to be a long burn as a result, and with the aforementioned burn time difficulties, it's going to make guessing this one a bit tricky. In the end, we have to take 2 goes at it. We get almost all of it done in the first try, and then we just have to travel around the planet a bit and use RCS thrusters just to make sure we are perfectly lined up and ready for our approach. So it's time for us to start lowering our orbit, and I'm going to do this in 2 parts. I thought going from 2,000 kilometres to 250 kilometres would probably give us too much relative velocity to the space station. and make slowing down in time a little bit risky. So we're first going to lower our orbit down to 500 kilometers and circularize from there before we start thinking about actually making our final approach to the space station. Now, the Galileo is already parked at the space station, and I was in two minds as to whether or not to send the Ptolemy there as well, thinking about the frame rate in and around the space station. But I decide, yeah, we'll give it a try. It shouldn't be too bad. As we approach the space station, this is where the unintended consequence of uninstalling better burn time really hits. You see, with better burn time, you get a nice little warning telling you when you'll be at your closest, when you should start burning to match speeds then, and of course if you're on a collision course, it tells you how to avoid that. But no, I got rid of that, didn't I? So well done me. But we go careful, we go cautious, and we do find ourselves arriving safe and sound at the space station. We bring the Ptolemy into dock. The frame rate isn't actually that bad, nowhere near as bad as I thought it might be. It will be interesting, though, when we send up the space plane to fetch everything that needs fetching, because that's quite a lot of parts. So, yeah, that'll be interesting when that gets here, but, you know, cross that bridge and all that. After some careful manoeuvring, we get the Ptolemy securely attached. We're not going to sort out any of the science at the moment. We'll sort everything out once our little taxi home arrives. Speaking of which... So Corkin and Jeblov come and hop into one of our Kestrel space planes, they fire up those engines and they start to take off. And this is it, the last mission of the last episode of this series. Much as with the last mission of the journey begins, our task here is a simple one. Go up, fetch the crew of the Ptolemy, bring back the science that we're bringing back down to Kerbin. Of course, half of it will be staying up, one set of it will be staying up to be processed in our orbital science lab, and then bring everything that we are bringing back down to the KSC. In the cargo bay, we have 2 experiment storage containers, one for the bulk of the science experiments, the other for any repeats, although I might just chuck those into the cockpit, we'll have to see. On this particular ascent, I do try to do something slightly different, as I often do with this craft, just to see if I can find any improvements, and what do you know, this time it works. We do get a little bit of extra delta V once we're in orbit, but this being the last episode of this series, by the time I use this craft again in any potential future series, I'll probably have forgotten and we'll be back to square one. Anyway, as we make our way towards our space station for the final time, for the time being at least, it is a moment tinged with sadness for me. I've done a lot in this series that I've never done in KSP before. It's also tinged with quite a lot of relief, though, because these episodes are a complete pain in the arse to make. God, it takes me absolutely ages. I think some episodes, it's been upwards of 10 hours game time. And then there's the voiceover and the editing and all that stuff. But yeah, very much mixed emotions with this one. As we approach the space station, once again we're being very careful. We try and slow down as early as possible, just to make sure we don't slam into it. Although, as things stand, we can just slip between the 2 craft, the Ptolemy and the Galileo, and that gets us pretty nicely set up for our docking manoeuvres. This all goes pretty smoothly. The frame rate has not dropped as much as I thought it would. I mean, it's still there, it's still noticeable, but certainly workable, and we get ourselves docked without too much difficulty. First of all, we're going to deal with the science, or the majority of it. We crack open the science bay aboard the Ptolemy. There's 2 experiment storage containers in there, each carrying an identical set of science. So we transfer one to the container attached to our lab, and the other to another one aboard the spaceplane's cargo bay. After that, we're going to transfer the majority of the crew, so Kerdard, Donfut and Bargel make their way through the space station and aboard our spaceplane, and all that's left is for Johnny Kerman to come aboard, along with those repeat experiments, so we're going to kill 2 birds with 1 stone here. Johnny Kerman pops out, he grabs that science, he spacewalks across, he chucks that science into the spaceplane's 2nd experiment storage container, and then hops aboard, and that is us done. All of our objectives for this mission have been completed, save, of course, for getting home. We detach from the space station, we open up a bit of separation, we burn retrograde to start lowering our orbit, and begin to make our way back down towards the KSC. Now, so far this mission has gone really well, so I was hoping to get a really good descent and a decent approach and landing, and It wasn't too bad. We don't flip out or lose control as we sometimes do with this space plane. I pretty much got that nailed, so that's good to see. We do overshoot the KRC a little bit. I think we've got quite a lot of fuel aboard this, so it makes it heavier. It doesn't slow down quite as much in the atmosphere, but we're not too far out. We can get ourselves turned around, bring ourselves into land, and it is a very good landing back on the runway. Our little haul from Dres gets us well over 7,000 points worth of science, giving us over 48,000 points worth of science in total, but we'll have to wait to spend that, because this will bring not only this episode, but as I said, all of the journey continues to an end. I do hope you've enjoyed it, everybody, not just this episode, but also this series. If you did and you haven't already, please consider liking, subscribing, following me on Twitter, getting involved with the Discord, all of the links down below. If you have any feedback about this episode or a previous episode or the journey continues as a whole, then please let me know in the comments, all gratefully received. I'll be back soon with some more Kerbal Space Program stuff, and who knows, in the near future, maybe a follow-up series will be appearing in your subscription feed. We'll have to see, but for the moment, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.